Now that's an introduction. I always thought the most useful child rearing advice I'd ever given was to a guy I saw trying to teach his kid to ride a two-wheeler. He was doing what I did with my two older boys, which is to push them along and then give them the last shove, and then they'd hang on for dear life and crash and skin their knees and elbows. But then somebody told me once that the real trick to doing it is to just turn in the direction you're falling. It sounds counterintuitive, but another son was coming along ready to learn to ride a bike, so I just said, Jason, turn in the direction you're about to fall, and he got it on the very first try. And I've been telling parents I see out teaching their kids to ride bikes that little trick ever since, and I presume it's worked well for them.
Think about writing a book.
I'm going to talk about two issues I realized I'd been thinking about for a long, long time. They each have to do with tension between interests at different levels, individual and group levels, I guess you could say. And in one case, thinking about the issue persuaded me that the outcomes you get in unfettered markets aren't nearly as bad as some of the people who are skeptical of markets think they're going to be. But in the other case, they're way worse than even the wildest proponents of markets ever could imagine. So in the first case, it's actually the issue that Joan referred to that I wrote about in Passions Within Reason. And I started thinking about it again when I heard David Sloan Wilson summarize the tension between individual and group interests. He said, selection at the individual level picks for vice. Selection at the group level picks for virtue. And I think I understand what he means, and there's a cogent narrative that you can weave around that little summary. But I think it's a way of summarizing the relevant issues that is profoundly misleading about what's going on. So I want to say a little bit about that. Let me just be clear at the outset that the problem that I'm talking about is cooperation in true one-shot dilemmas. I think this is still the source of an enormous amount of confusion. The economists, I think, are much more focused on the distinction between one-shot and repeated dilemmas than people in other fields tend to be. So I think when I'm talking with people in other fields, I get the sense that a lot of our failure to connect on this issue has to do with just the difference in emphases in the different fields. But I want to talk about situations where you have an opportunity to come out ahead if you do the opportunistic choice, and there's no chance that you'll be punished or in any way compromised for doing it. A lot of people, I think particularly among evolutionary psychologists, say, well, there never were any situations like that in the ancestral environment. That's surely false. And anyway, it doesn't have to be a situation where there's zero chance that you'd be caught and punished. The behavior that gets you the best expected outcome in a resource sense is the one that depends on the probabilities of being caught and punished. If they're low enough, then it will pay you to cheat in situations like that. So when I would think about just examples from the familiar everyday environments, tipping on the road. You're at a restaurant in a city you don't plan to visit again anytime soon. You've just run up a $200 tab. The bill has come. Your choice is to pay $200 and walk out, or pay $200 plus, let's say, a $40 tip if you tip at the expected rate. Which would be better? Well, it seems to me if you take the self-interest model seriously, the better outcome is not to leave a tip, because there'll be no consequence to you failing to do so. The waiter might get angry. So what if the waiter gets angry? People will say, well, the waiter might come after you and make a scene. Well, if you believe in the self-interest model, that can't be right, because why would the waiter risk losing his job just to discipline you so you'll tip the next time some other place where he won't be the recipient of the tip. Or the waiter might be related to you. You grow up and we evolved in environments where everybody was kin at not very much remove. That's a really silly argument in my opinion, because in bands of 150, you had second, third, fourth cousins, people who were related to you by a tiny amount that it wouldn't have paid to be nice to in one-shot dilemmas just to protect survival of genes like the ones they carried. Or it's always reputation. You can never be sure someone's looking. Again, there are situations where it's clearly in your interest, in the narrow, to cheat. And if people don't cheat, it's because they've chosen for some other reason not to cheat. The cheap explanation is you get a warm glow from doing the right thing. But then that raises the question of why would creatures who'd evolved in competitive conditions get a warm glow from that? Why wouldn't they get a warm glow from not doing the right thing, since that would result in more resources and larger clutch sizes and the like? People give to National Public Radio when they have the campaign. The announcers will say, if you don't give, we can't keep All Things Considered on the air. That's true. If nobody gives, they can't. But whether you give or not, it's either going to be on the air or not, independently of your choice. And so why don't you get a warm glow from figuring that out and realizing that it doesn't matter whether you give to National Public Radio when they ask. But that's not the way people tend to size up. Some people might say, well, it doesn't pay to make the calculation because you're so often in situations where others might be looking that it's just a prudent rule of thumb to do the right thing when there are only small sums at stake because somebody might be looking. That seems like a fair argument to offer, but once an economist has gone to the trouble of figuring out for you that if you're in a restaurant far from home that you never plan to visit again, it wouldn't pay to leave a tip in that situation, then the cognitive effort's zero for you. You can just free ride on the fact that the economist pointed that out to you. But when economists point that out to people, people don't say, oh, why didn't I think of that? From now on, I'm not going to leave tip. I'm not going to leave tips when I'm on the road. The reaction is more likely to be what creeps these economists are, that they think about the problem in that way. So there's a lot of evidence that people cooperate in pure one-shot prisoners' dilemmas. And I think the way a lot of people understand group selection arguments of the sort David Sloan Wilson has been the most prominent champion of in recent years. The idea is that, well, the honest people are going to get screwed within the group, but the group's going to do so much better if there are a lot of honest people in it that it's going to be able to field a more effective army, and it's going to overrun other groups, and so the nice people within the group are going to become numerous fast enough that we'll still manage to keep a certain amount of decent behavior pumped up. And that's, I think, the misleading narrative suggested by individual selection chooses for, or helps mold vice in people, and group selection helps mold virtue. The alternative account that I advocated for was one of selective interaction among people who just wanted to do the right thing for its own sake. Imagine a one-shot prisoner's dilemma. That's how we make our living, is interacting with one another in pairs in a situation like that. Some people cooperate in those situations, others defect. If it were true that you could tell which person was which, you would always do fine in that situation if you were a cooperator. Suppose, for example, that the cooperators had a birthmark on their forehead in the form of a red C that flagged them as cooperators. Then they would pair off, seeing a C on one another's foreheads. They'd receive the higher payoff that cooperators get in the prisoner's dilemma in comparison to the payoff that the defectors get when they interact with one another. And soon enough, it would be the defectors that were relegated to the evolutionary scrap heap. That obviously hasn't happened yet, so we got to reject the model that there's a costless way of telling who's a decent person and who's not. But you don't have to sort of relax the description by much. Just imagine that you can gain some insight by scrutinizing people, but there's some error involved in the process. So here's a thought experiment. You've come home from a crowded concert. You had an envelope in your pocket with $10,000 in cash in it that you were going to use to buy a used car. Tomorrow morning, the owner wanted cash for the car. It had your name and address on it. You picked it up from the bank before going to the concert. You get home, and it's missing from your coat pocket. And then you realize that little flap sound you heard must have been the sound of the envelope falling onto the concert floor as you left your seat. 10,000 bucks in the envelope. Can you think of anybody who's not related to you by blood or marriage who you feel sure would return your envelope with the cash in it? I won't ask you for a show of hands, but I'll say that when I've talked to people about this, the typical response is, well, sure. I can think of several people I'd feel sure. Well, for the couple of questions. The fact that you feel sure doesn't mean it's so. It'd be hard to do the relevant experiment to see whether you're right about that. But we have done experiments to see whether people can make predictions about smaller stakes things, and people are pretty good at that. So when Tom Gilovich and Dennis Regan and I did some experiments with one-shot prisoners' dilemmas, we went to great lengths to make sure that nobody would know who'd defected and who'd cooperated. And when we asked people to predict what each of their two partners would do in a simple game played for money, first of all, the cooperation rate was very high. It was 75%. They had a chance to talk to one another for 30 minutes. The main punchline of the story, though, was we asked them to predict what their partners would do. And if their predictions were no better than chance, you would expect them to be right in each category prediction at the base rate for that category. So if I predict you'll cooperate, I'll be right 75% of the time if that's the base rate, if my prediction adds no value. And similarly, if I predict you'll defect, I'll be right a quarter of the time. So in that experiment, predictions of cooperation were right 83% of the time. Doesn't sound like a big advantage, but the window is narrowing as the cooperation rate edges up toward 100%. There's only so much room to do better than chance. On the defect side, if you predict your partner will defect, people were right 58% of the time, again, against a base rate of 25% cooperation. So it's not perfect, but it doesn't have to be perfect. We're looking for people we can send to a distant location to manage a branch office. We can't monitor them. They can cheat us if they want to. Is there anyone I can trust to do that job? Well, you should send the guy you pick who would return your $10,000 in the envelope. So that's the narrative. So I called that an individual selectionist argument. Here's a guy, he's born with some hardware in his brain that is receptive to cultural conditioning about doing the right thing when no one's looking. He buys into the story. And then if he does the wrong thing when no one's looking, he blushes or he gets embarrassed, or there's just something about him that you can sense. Whatever it is about the person you named as the one who would return your $10,000 if he or she found it. Can't be, because there'd be a penalty if she didn't return it. You won't know that you found it. It was an anonymous situation. Can't be that you've got data that bears directly on what she would do in that situation. When did you ever lose $10,000 at a crowded concert? It's just you feel you know the person well enough to be able to say confidently that it wouldn't compute for her to steal your $10,000. She'd feel bad about it. It would never sort of leave her as a sense of shame and embarrassment about it. If you can make those kinds of assessments about people, however imperfectly, then those people can be rewarded often enough by being chosen as valued team members in ventures that require trust that they can do quite nicely in material terms when they're competing against the purely opportunistic alternatives. You don't have to appeal to their group overrunning some other group and them somehow hanging on if their group can be successful enough. Now, David Sloan Wilson was critical of that argument, saying, no, that's a group selectionist argument. And he patiently guided me through why he thought that. He said that it's the cooperating or the dyad that's the unit of selection in that argument. So the cooperators who find one another and pair off and get high payoffs relative to the payoffs that the pairs of defectors get, that it's those groups that are prospering relative to the other groups. Okay, he persuaded me you could call that a group selectionist argument. But go back to the original point I made, which is that if you think that group selection favors altruism, individual selection favors defection or lack of cooperation, it's a very different sense you get from that way of phrasing the argument. The argument, as I've put it forward, seems to me a much more, I think it's the only reason Joan would have directed Sam and what's your daughter's name? Ruby to think about that argument in situations like the one you described. I remember after the book came out, I got some angry messages saying it wasn't proper to be moral because you thought it was going to benefit you to be moral. And that misses the whole point of the argument. If you thought somebody was being moral because you were going to watch them and think they were moral and therefore they were going to get benefit from that, you wouldn't want to choose that person as a member for your team. He'd be exactly the kind of person who, once he was sure no one was looking, would cheat you. So basically, I think if you take my interpretation of that narrative as an individual selectionist narrative, I think that's an important point. It's one that when I talk to people about these issues, people still don't seem to get. I hear, oh, it's all about, it's all fundamentally selfish. It's all about repeated prisoner's dilemmas. It's all about, or it's reciprocal altruism. I'm going to do something for you, but then unless there's some prospect you'll do something back for me, that's all going to break down. No, people just care about doing the right thing. They get a warm glow from doing the right thing. And it may be that in many contexts in which they do the right thing, nobody ever knows about it. Nobody ever pays them back in any way for that. It's a loss in material terms. All that's necessary in that account is that people be able to make a reasonable inference that that's the kind of person you are and that they can choose you as a partner in situations requiring trust. You're a valued team member. That's the spirit of the argument. And I think I'm much more comfortable with that framing of the argument if I'm talking to my kids about why you shouldn't do some of the things we don't want them to do than to say group selection will keep you afloat somehow in the long run. Okay, that's the first of the two issues involving individual and group conflict that I wanted to talk about. The other one is one I talk about in my most recent book published in the fall. I'm going to talk about that in the Marshak colloquium tomorrow that Mark hosts. I'll try to just give a quick précis of some of the issues I won't have time to talk about in that forum tomorrow. But if you're interested in these issues, I hope you'll find your way over there. What time is it? At 1 o'clock?
1 o'clock, Anderson, Building C, Corn Convocation Hall.
Thanks. So in the book, purely as a marketing gimmick, after long conversations with the publisher, I offered the prediction that 100 years from now, if we asked professional economists who is the intellectual founder of their discipline, that we'd get a plurality responding Charles Darwin rather than Adam Smith, which is, of course, what 99% of economists would say today. And the idea of the prediction is that I think Darwin's understanding of how competition affects the welfare of individuals and the groups they belong to is much more descriptive of the actual reality that we confront out there than not Adam Smith's description. I think that's an unfair charge, and I didn't make it. I was pretty clear in the book about this. But it's a much better description of the reality than the one offered by Adam Smith's modern disciples, the free market enthusiasts who say Adam Smith thought that all you need to do is turn selfish individuals loose in the marketplace, and self-interest will be channeled through market forces as if by an invisible hand to produce the greatest good for the greatest number. That was certainly not Smith's view. Smith was very skeptical of markets. In fact, if you read Smith carefully, he sounds kind of like a whiny left-winger in terms of his concerns about the market. He was really worried that there were actors out there, monopsonists and monopolists with market power. If we didn't keep a close eye on them and regulate them, they would exploit their workers, they would fool their consumers, they would overcharge them, they would drive rivals out of business and then raise prices. So, I mean, these are all things that have happened historically. They happen even now. They happen much more often when Smith was writing than they happen now, I believe. Now, the concern of that ilk that I think we really need to take more seriously than we do is the ability of actors with market power to buy favors from the government. That's the real threat to society's welfare now. It's not from exploiting consumers and workers. The markets that we see out there now, product markets and labor markets, are way more competitive than they've ever been. They're not perfectly competitive, but I'm happy to grant all the libertarians' core assumptions. People are rational. They're not rational, obviously. The behavioral economists have made lots of headlines by showing that people aren't rational. You can sort of guide people into little corners of the decision space where they'll have all the relevant information at their fingertips and they'll still screw up. Tversky was really, with Kahneman, the founder of that movement, and Tversky liked to say, my colleagues, they study artificial intelligence. Me, I study natural stupidity. It was just the idea that people just keep getting it wrong. That was so, and 99% of the work in behavioral economics has been about that. But that's really, I think, in the end, not going to be seen as the interesting legacy of that work. I think the kinds of mistakes people make are costly sometimes, but if they're really costly and you're worried about them, then there are lots of things you can do to address those on your own. You can hire advisors, you can sign contracts that limit your freedom to do things that you think you ought not to do, and so on. Where the real rub comes, I think, in the marketplace is from Darwin's insight that whereas individual interests and social interests are sometimes in harmony, as in the versions that you'll hear of Adam Smith's invisible hand story, they're not always. So let me try to unpack that just briefly. So take Adam Smith's version of the invisible hand story. I'm, by the way, an ardent admirer of Smith's. I think it's a tragedy that students get out of college not knowing the wonder of what he contributed. The basic invisible hand idea is one that's going to stand as a landmark achievement in human intellectual history forever. It was the notion that the entrepreneur who introduces a cost-saving innovation or a product design improvement isn't trying to serve society, he's trying to steal market share away from his rivals. I think other people knew that well enough before Smith pointed it out. But the earlier writers hadn't really perceived and understood the dynamic that first step set in motion nearly to the degree that Smith did. Do they sit idly by when they start to lose market share? No, they fight back. They copy the innovation is the main thing they do. And as the innovation diffuses, the competition from rival producers drives the price, and it broadens the availability of the innovation, drives the price down back to the new lower cost of production. When the dust settles from all that churning, the beneficiaries of it are the consumers who get better, cheaper products. The producers just earn enough to cover their costs the same as before. They'll get a little window of profit, but that's a fleeting thing. And that's really the narrative that has accounted for why we're so much richer now than we used to be. And that's a good thing. I think the people who think wealth doesn't matter haven't thought hard enough about it. You know, if you live in a poor place, a goodly fraction of the kids born to parents die before they get to be 10. That's, I'm guessing, not the kind of thing you get used to. even if it's a common thing to occur in your society. There's a lot of things that are just way better when we're wealthy than when we're poor. So that kind of coincidence between individual interests and social interests is an important insight, I think, and we owe it to Smith. Darwin saw lots of parallel stories in nature, stories that were essentially point by point identical to that one. So the keen eyesight of the hawk. Let me tape the white pages, a sheet from the white pages on the back wall with their 6-point type. A hawk where I'm standing here could look back there, and if you could read it all, could see every number on the page. I would barely be able to tell there was anything on the page. How did they get such keen eyesight? Well, it's a simple account in Darwin's terms. There was a mutation. It coded for a slightly different shape to the cornea. I don't know, I have no idea what it did. But it made the animal better able to see. It caught more mice. It left more offspring, therefore. The offspring all had the mutation too. Another mutation occurred. They accreted one upon another, and over the millennia, gradually, a really keen visual system was crafted in the hawk, and that was something that was step-by-step advantageous to the individual hawk. If you saw better, you did better, and it's incredibly advantageous to hawks as a group. Maybe individually there's no advantage to seeing well as a hawk in terms of your fitness vis-a-vis other hawks, since everybody sees well in your group now, but the species as a group has prospered enormously because of that. So there's the invisible hand story. Individual interests, group interests in nice tight harmony. But then there were lots of other cases that didn't at all resemble that narrative. So think about the antlers of the bull elk. This is one of the signature examples I focused on in the book. The modern animals have antlers that are 4 feet across and weigh 40 pounds. In one sense, that's bad. If you get chased into a thicket by wolves, you're basically done for. They can easily surround you, and you can't maneuver well enough to respond. They kill you and eat you. That's a bad outcome from the perspective of the bull elk. Why are they so big then? Well, Darwin's explanation was simple. It was that like males in most vertebrate species, bull elk take more than one mate if they can. The qualifier is important. If some succeed, others don't get any mates at all, which is the ultimate loser slot in that scheme. And so, of course, they take any step open to them to prevent themselves from being frozen out in that competition, and they fight with one another, as males do in many vertebrate species. And if you had bigger antlers than your rival, you were more likely to prevail in one of those fights. So a mutation comes along that has n equal 110 rather than n equals 60, and the antlers are a little bigger on that animal. He wins lots of battles, and it spreads, and they accrete, and so on. You get finally an equilibrium where we've got these massive antlers. They're not good for bulls as a group, is my claim. That's my simple claim that I make here. If they were cognitively capable of apprehending the nature of the situation they were in, and you gave them a red button they could depress with a hoof, that when they did it, all antlers would shrink by half, they would have a compellingly powerful reason to go after that red button. All the antlers would be smaller by half. Relative antler size wouldn't change one whit. The same fights would be decided as before, and fewer bulls would be surrounded at young ages and killed prematurely by wolves in dense wooded areas. That's the only point of that example. The individual interests of the bulls and the interests of bulls as a group are in sharp conflict in that case. Darwin wasn't much worried about what to do about that in non-human animal species. What the hell could they do? I mean, there's really no... They can't have a town meeting or rub their antlers on a rough rock and make them smile. It's just not one of the things that would be on their menu of possibilities. So yeah, too bad. That's the way it is. The book came out, when it came out in September, shortly after it came out, there was a very prominent review of it posted in Slate. I was very excited. I saw it was a great big picture of Darwin. And then I saw the subtitle of the review, What the Darwin Economy Gets Wrong About Evolution. I said, oh, you know, can you edit that out of the tape? I'm sorry. I forgot I'd given a, you can't? No. Oh, come on. I'll tear up my consent form. You can't do it. So I said, what's going on here? Did I miss something? I read the review with great apprehension, and I felt relieved as I got further into it. Oh, it's John Whitfield, the reviewer, a science writer from the UK, who's failed to understand basic evolutionary theory, not me. And gradually, my reaction gave way from relief to anger. Wow, he's really trashed my book in a very prominent place. It may never recover. I think probably it never did recover from that. How many of you heard of it? Probably none of you even heard of this book. Why would anyone want to read about what a book gets wrong about evolution? His argument, astonishingly to me, was that if big antlers were a problem, natural selection would have long since weeded out any animal with antlers that were too big. Think about that. This is a science writer. So yeah, at some point, natural selection says enough with the antlers. We don't see antlers that are 40 feet across, that weigh 400 pounds. If there were a mutation that coded for antlers like that, the animal would never reach adulthood. It would never be able to get its nose off the turf. It would never compete successfully for a mate. The mutation would die then and there. So there's an equilibrium. The point is that the equilibrium is inefficient from the perspective of bull elk as a group. Then there's the issue of it's not bad for elk as a species. Maybe it isn't bad for elk as a species. Vertebrate sexually reproducing species have too many males. Biologists have known that for a long time. Why so many males? That's just the R.A. Fisher equilibrium. If there weren't 50-50 sex ratios, you could have more grandchildren by having whichever one was in the minority. So yeah, there are too many males. That's another conflict between individual and group if you want to stop and think about it. But the fact that there's an equilibrium doesn't mean that it's optimal. This is an old idea in economics. It's an old idea in biology, presumably, but there you have it. So the antlers are too big. The peacock's tail, the feathers are too long. If you didn't have long ones, you wouldn't get any mates, though, so you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. These are all situations where the equilibrium is driven by individual interest, and it runs counter to what would be good for some larger group. So think about the signs you see on a commercial strip. You're a merchant thinking about putting a sign up. What's your goal? You want to attract the attention of the passing motorist. Well, what must be true about your sign is that it stand out relative to the signs of other merchants on the same strip. So it's got to be taller, it's got to stick out farther, it's got to have brighter lights than it. And so the equilibrium is not signs a mile high, but signs way higher than you would think prudent, signs that stick out way farther, that have way brighter lights on them. It's an aesthetic nightmare, if you want one man's opinion. I know it's risky to venture into questions of design and taste like that, but I think it's a widely shared opinion when you present landscapes of urban unzoned commercial strips. Most people say, ooh, when they see that. But the mistake would be to conclude that you get situations like that because the merchants are stupid or because they don't know what their own interests are, or they lack design sensibilities. They weren't trained for that. That's not the reason you get bad outcomes there. It's because they're in an arms race for attention, and the deciding factor is how big your sign is relative to other signs. So this really transforms how you think about the free market system. If you think about it, Darwin's great insight, I think, still will be seen as the simple observation that life's graded on the curve in one way or another. It's not how fast you are, how strong you are, how smart you are that matters. It's whether you're better at the things that count than the people you're competing directly with. That's the key. And because we are in competition with one another, we face very powerful incentives to take steps to improve our chances of winning in those contests. And many of the steps we take are mutually offsetting in the same way that taller signs are mutually offsetting. One of the first examples of this ilk that caught my attention years ago was Tom Schelling's example of hockey helmet rules in micromotives and macro behavior. I think eventually it will be seen as his enduring work. The Nobel Committee cited the strategy of conflict much more prominently, but I think this will have a much more enduring impact. His hockey helmet story was, look, he's a lifelong hockey fan. He watches games in person on TV in Boston. Always, when there's no rule, players skate without a helmet. You can look at any league, that's the way it is. And yet, players will vote, often unanimously, for a rule requiring that helmets be worn in the contest. And so he says, what's going on here? If helmets are so great, why don't you just wear one? How come you need a rule? And his answer sort of captures the idea of the conflict that's driving a lot of this inefficiency. So I take my helmet off, I can see better, I can hear better. Maybe I'm better able to intimidate my opponents because I'm crazy enough to skate without a helmet. They better give me a little wider berth, knowing that I'm willing to do that. And so I get a competitive edge. And if you've ever been an athlete, you know that getting even a slight competitive edge is really what competition is all about. If it means you might get a head injury, that's later, or that's maybe. That can't compete with a competitive edge right now. And so we take our helmets off, we get an edge, they see that we got an edge, they don't sit idly by, they take their helmets off too. We're all skating without helmets and no one gets an edge. And yet we're all more vulnerable to head injuries. And so reluctantly, people seem to realize unless we have a rule, we're not going to get where we want to get to. So they vote for a rule, they have to wear helmets, and then lo and behold, that's the best outcome they can hope for. So somebody comes along and objects to the rule that it violates the freedom of individual hockey players to decide for themselves whether to wear a helmet. What a stupid objection. Of course it does that. It's the whole point of the rule. What if somebody objected that a military arms control agreement between equally matched nations who could verify and inspect, they sign an agreement to limit the amount of bombs they build, somebody objects, that limits our nation's freedom to decide for itself how many bombs to build. What a totally beside the point objection that would be. Of course. That's the whole point of the agreement. So this isn't controversial, any of this. If you understand what the incentives are, there's nothing to argue about. You get bad outcomes in these situations. Is it better to try to do something about it? That's question number two. You can't, I tell my students this, I don't know if they believe it, but I tell it to them many times. You can't presume, just because you've identified an imperfect outcome in the marketplace, that an intervention managed by a government will lead to a better outcome. Maybe the intervention will be so clumsy and ham-fisted that you get an even worse outcome. And we all have our favorite examples of how that seemed to have happened in specific cases. But that's different from saying that you couldn't get a better outcome. You need, in order to make that judgment, you need to examine the details of the specific case. Think about safety regulation. This is a case that's exactly analogous to Schelling's hockey helmet example. So I'm a worker. I'm looking for a way to send my kids to the best possible school I can. Does anyone not know that the good schools are in the more expensive neighborhoods? Has that escaped anyone's attention? That's the way it is in every country, whether the budgets are different or not. They are in this country, so that reinforces the problem. But even in Paris, where the budget is the same in every school everywhere around the country, and the syllabus is the same. You're on the same page of the same syllabus every day. But still, the better schools are the ones that are located in the more expensive areas, because that's where the sons and daughters of the more successful people who've had better opportunities all the way along go, and so the standards are inevitably higher in those schools. Your kid will learn more if she goes to one of those schools. So parents want that. You can't fault them for wanting that, certainly. And so they ask, how can I get my kid into the best possible school? If I'm the median earner, what must I do just to send my kids to a school of average quality? I've got to outbid 50% of all parents for a house in the median school district. Otherwise, I'll send my kids to a school where other kids score in the 20th percentile in reading and math, or where there are metal detectors out front, or there'll be some compelling reason not to want to go there. So what can I do? One thing I can do is take a riskier job. There are lots of things. You can work longer hours, you can commute longer distances, lots of ways to try and scrape together more money, but working a riskier job is a time-honored one. If they don't pay you more when the job's riskier, who would take the riskier job? So of course you can make more money that way. And the right wing has what's always struck me as a great rhetorical club that it uses when anybody comes out in favor of safety regulations. How is it exactly you're making people better off? Here's a firm that knowingly offers the worker a higher wage in return for his willingness to undertake the riskier task. And the worker who understands the risk, maybe you could find a case where they didn't understand the risk, all right, so limit it to ones where they do, and there are many, where the worker agrees in full knowledge of the risk that he's taking, that it's worth taking that risk in order to get the higher wage, and so he takes it. And then he takes the higher wage he gets and he bids successfully for a house in a better school district. Why isn't that a perfectly praiseworthy thing for him to have done? And we wouldn't want to tinker with that one bit. We'll make him worse off if we block that contract. I would say fine if the contract had no adverse effects on anyone else, but think about it. If somebody moves up in a hierarchy, others necessarily move down in the same hierarchy. There's only 50% of the slots in the top half. So if others take riskier jobs and bid more aggressively for houses in better school districts, and you don't, your kids move behind in the school quality distribution. So you match. That's what most parents do. Or if banks are more liberal in what they'll lend you, others borrow more to bid for houses in better school districts. You know you can't afford it, but what's the option? To send your kids to the crummy schools. You match. You borrow more yourself. All those steps are rational at the individual level. We don't have to invoke Kahneman and Tversky cognitive limitations. People know what they're doing when they're making these choices. The rub is that when everybody bids more intensively for a house in a better school district, all they succeed in doing is bidding up the prices in the better school districts. Still 50% of the kids go to bottom half schools just as before. So what about a regulation that says, well, risks only up to this level are permitted in the workplace? Well, you could get into all sorts of process arguments. Well, they'll write the regulations in such a clumsy way that it won't work, and there are good examples of that from the OSHA manual, I think. Or you could say, maybe we should think about how to write the safety regulations. Maybe a stiffer injury tax would be the efficient way to give workers and firms an incentive to avoid riskier behavior in the workplace. And if everybody could be assured that no one else would take risks, they might be much happier with the lower wages and safer jobs as a package than the alternative package where everybody earned a little more, but the money was frittered away on a fruitless bidding war for houses in better school districts. It's just the difference between individual interest and group interest. There's no controversial step anywhere in the argument. So I'm granting the libertarians their core assumptions. People are rational. Markets are competitive. You can't make me buy Microsoft. They got plenty of advertising dollars, but you can't make me buy from them. If there's a better product out there, and there is, the producer finds me, and he makes it known that there's a better product, and I buy it. The old days when they could foist crummy stuff on you are really things of the past. If there's an opportunity where a consumer is being forced to buy a crummy product at high prices, rival entrepreneurs see cash on the table, and they can mobilize and serve markets like that pretty quickly. So basically, I think what emerges from this is just a a reasoned account of why it would be better to abandon all the political rhetoric that's been driving the conversation for the past years. Government is always evil, or markets are always evil. You got to regulate everything. You shouldn't regulate anything, in favor of a concession that individual and group interests often are profoundly in conflict, and often there are steps you can take that are relatively unintrusive that can help bring individual and group incentives more closely into line. I did what do you call those things that you do with where two of you talk on the Skype? Blogging Heads. I did a Blogging Heads thing with the editor of Reason magazine, and the New York Times clipped out a little 5-minute segment of us arguing about whether vehicles should be taxed by weight. I, of course, said they should. He, of course, said they shouldn't. But it's interesting. If I buy a heavier vehicle, I may have a perfectly good reason for buying a heavier vehicle. Maybe I need to tow my boat up into the mountains every weekend. And that, if you don't have a big, heavy vehicle with a lot of power, you're not going to be able to do that. If I buy a heavier vehicle, I put you and every other pedestrian and motorist at greater risk of injury and death. And there are people out there who are just on the cusp of whether they buy the heavy version or the lighter version. I'm going to buy a 7,000-pound SUV or a 4,000-pound station wagon. They both have the same hauling capacity. Why anybody bought SUVs in the first place still puzzles the engineers in Detroit. You know, why were people buying these things? They handle poorly. They don't haul much cargo. So you can go off-road. Who goes off-road? Nobody goes off-road. But there's a guy, so he gets the SUV, he doesn't care, so he has a mild preference for it. And then everybody else is at greater risk. If the vehicles were taxed by weight, he'd say, the hell with it, I'm gonna buy the station wagon. And that would be one less dollar we'd need to raise for every dollar he paid in vehicle weight tax. That'd be one less dollar we'd need to raise taxing savings, which we do now, taxing job creation, which we do now when we have a payroll tax. There are all these things we tax that are useful. We don't need to do that. We could tax only activities that cause harm to others. And once you realize that life's graded on the curve and that things I do to get ahead are exactly offset by the countermeasures you take to keep from falling behind, then there's a revenue bonanza out there. Are the rich people happier when the mansions go from 30 to 40,000 square feet each? No. It just raises the bar that defines how big a mansion you need if you're in that circle. You have to entertain in a certain standard now, and so you need a bigger one. Or are they happier when the coming of age parties cost $10 million rather than $8 million? Are the kids happier? The weddings in the U.S., last year I had was 2009, $30,000 on average. It was $11,000 in inflation-adjusted terms in 1980. Are the people getting married happier? No, nobody thinks that. So this is completely uncontroversial. The key policy recommendation in the book is that we scrap the income tax in favor of a much more steeply progressive tax on how much you spend in total each year. You report your income to the IRS, then you report how much you save, just like you would for a 401k account. The difference, income minus savings, that's how much you spent during the year. And that amount minus a big standard deduction would be what you're taxed on. Low rates in the beginning, and the rates keep going up and up. They can go up as high as we want them to go up. They might be 100% on marginal spending above $5 million a year. So you think about putting a wing on your mansion. All right, you got to pay the contractor, same as before, but now you got to pay that same amount to the government in tax on the cost of the addition. And in that case, people would build smaller additions on their mansions. People object, well, the rich wouldn't need to do that. They have more money than they can spend anyway. Look at New York, where price per square foot is higher than anywhere, and look at the square footage of living space in New York. It's way, way smaller than it is in places where prices per square foot are lower, even though they could afford to pay more. You don't need to spend more than others are spending. There's a standard, there's a norm, there's a context. So it's fiscal alchemy in one sense. You just change this simple aspect of the tax structure, and you get, by my crude count, $2–3 trillion a year extra in resources freed up by doing less of things that weren't doing anything for anybody. What's not to like about that? So, as usual, I thought, all right, so I've explained all this clearly. The book comes out. We got a campaign coming up. This will be the issue we talk about in the campaign. But I should have known. We're still hearing the slogans. We're not having a debate about what to do. We're just having a shouting match where you have reasonable proposals voiced quietly, and then slogans yelled at very high volume about why that's ridiculous. You can't even consider it. And I think until we can get past that, we're not going to get out from under the burden that we've been operating under. You know, we need to make some changes. I think that's clear enough. Anyway, that's more time than I should take talking. I'm glad to take questions if anybody has any.